It's a few weeks before Passover. I know some of our viewers will be seeing this in the coming weeks and perhaps even afterwards. So I'm just wondering if you have any women or institutions or themes or something that you feel we ought to keep in our minds and in our hearts as we approach the Seder. Andrea?
Well, we're thinking about, at National Council of Jewish Women, we're the co-chair of a coalition called We Were Slaves, which is a coalition of Jewish organizations united against sex trafficking, which is, we consider to be the most heinous form of modern day slavery. And we're trying to raise awareness really here in the US that sex trafficking is not just something that happens overseas, far away, in places like Bangkok, or here in the US, it's not just something that happens to immigrants lured here under false pretenses. Those things do happen, but that sex trafficking is something that happens to, New York girls and children and women, right, born and bred right here in the city, who are lured by the tactics of traffickers and pimps, mostly children who were abused in their own homes, and fall into being trafficked by someone who they usually consider a boyfriend, and who's really anything but. And if there's one thing even the least observant of Jews know at Passover time, it's that once we were slaves in Egypt.
Yeah, they do.
If there's one thing you take away from that Maxwell
Matzah
House
and
Haggadah, it is that once we were slaves in Egypt. And so there's a natural tendency to stand in solidarity with anyone being enslaved today.
Right on. Right.
Lenore, do you have any special traditions or things that are
special traditions, wacky ones? We sing. This is not going to advance the discussion at all. But we sing. It would have been sufficient. It would have been sufficient.
Oh, we do
it
that.
Would have been sufficient. Sufficient. It would have been. Right.
We have a version of that as well for Dayenu.
Yeah. And we have an Exodus rap. But I love the idea of fighting for freedom. I was just thinking about one woman who is sort of fighting for freedom in a sphere that I'm familiar with, which is that Danielle Métive, Jewish mom down in Maryland, suburban Maryland, is the one who let her children walk home from the park, actually on Shabbat. And the family was investigated for child abuse and neglect because their children were 10 and 6, and they were walking home unsupervised for a mile in suburban Maryland. And they have stood up to the cops and the CPS officials who have been investigating them as if they were careless parents who didn't care if their children lived or died, which is why they left them outside. No, they left them to walk home on their own because they wanted to give their children freedom, and they wanted their children to grow up street smart and independent and self-reliant in a sort of old-fashioned way. So I think of her as a freedom fighter in this particular Passover because they were found responsible for unsubstantiated neglect, and they're going forward and trying to appeal that.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that is a powerful story. Yeah. Esther, what's on your mind?
I think on the heels of thinking about women who are enslaved in our own society, in our own neighborhoods, I think about a different kind of enslavement, an enslavement of the culture that portrays women as emaciated. We are bombarded with images of starving women as models. We idealize them, our young girls idealize them. And what I would really like to see is a freedom from that oppression, both from the external societal oppression of the images and the ideals, the tyranny of slenderness that we think we have to aspire to, and our own internal oppression, that we take in these images and messages from the external environment and we impose them on ourselves. So if we think of Pesach and matzah, and matzah being the poor
skinny
man's bread, right? I think that it's fine to eat matzah for 8 days, but I think for the rest of the year we should be eating those lovely rolls and really enjoying ourselves to our fullest and not worrying about these things.
The looks.